The storm that night wasn't just rain and thunder, it was judgment itself descending on Coyote Fork. Lightning split the sky like God's own wrath as Silas Rowe stood in the churning mud outside the church, his weathered hands trembling around his walking stick. Through the sheets of rain, he could see the crowd pressed beneath the church's overhanging roof, and their faces twisted with the peculiar hunger that came with watching other people's misery. Lot number 7. Reverend Claiborne's voice cut through the storm like a blade through flesh. A fine specimen, gentlemen, 7 years old, healthy stock, and ready for Christian discipline. The child on the auction block, nothing more than a wooden crate dragged from the church basement, looked like a ghost made flesh in the lightning's glare. Her thin dress clung to her shaking frame, dark hair plastered to her skull. But it was her face that stopped Silas's heart cold. Those brown eyes, that stubborn chin, the way she held herself even in terror, it was Lucille standing there. His dead daughter, 20 years younger, waiting to be sold like livestock. Silas's breath came in ragged gasps. The guilt he'd carried for 2 decades suddenly felt like a physical weight, crushing his chest. This was his doing. His pride, his cruelty, his cowardice. It had all led to this moment when his own blood was being bartered away to the highest bidder. What am I bid for this little dove? Claiborne continued, his pale eyes scanning the crowd with the satisfaction of a spider admiring its web. She's been well trained by our local washerwoman, knows her letters can work a kitchen perfect for a family seeking domestic assistance. The way he said those last words made Silas's skin crawl. Everyone knew what Claiborne's placements really meant. But nobody talked about it. Not openly. The children simply disappeared into the vast territory, and their absence was explained away with paperwork and pious platitudes about Christian charity. $50. The voice came from the back of the crowd. Jacob Gaskell, his face scarred from knife fights and his eyes dead as a shark's. Behind him lurked his brother Ezra, both of them grinning with anticipation. The child Josie, they called her, never moved. She stood perfectly still as the bidding climbed higher, as her fate was decided by men who saw her as nothing more than an investment. But when lightning flashed again, Silas caught sight of her eyes, and what he saw there nearly broke him. She wasn't just afraid. She was resigned. At 7 years old, she'd already learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. $75 to the Gaskill brothers, Claiborne announced. Going once, a hand touched Silas's arm. He turned to see Maeve McCarthy, the Irish washerwoman who'd raised the girl since birth. Her face was streaked with tears and rain, her gray hair hanging in soaked strands around her shoulders. "Please," she whispered, her brogue thick with desperation. "She's just a baby. She don't deserve what they'll do to her." Silas stared at her, then back at the child on the block. The resemblance was undeniable now that he knew to look for it. The same delicate features that had made Lucille the prettiest girl in 3 counties. The same stubborn tilt to the chin that had driven him to fury when she defied him. The same eyes that had looked at him with love, even as he cast her out into the storm. "She's not my concern," he said. But the words tasted like poison on his tongue. "Ain't she—" Maeve's voice cracked with emotion. "Ain't she your own granddaughter, your daughter's child? Look at her, Silas. Look at those eyes and tell me you don't see Lucille staring back at you." "Going twice," Claiborne's voice boomed through the thunder. Silas opened his mouth, but pride and shame warred in his throat, choking off the words that might have saved her. 20 years of telling himself he'd done the right thing, 20 years of justifying the unjustifiable, and now it was too late. "Sold." The gavel came down with the finality of a coffin lid closing. As the Gaskill brothers moved to claim their purchase, Silas saw something die in the child's eyes. The last ember of hope snuffed out like a candle in the wind. She didn't resist as rough hands lifted her from the block, didn't cry out as she was carried toward a wagon that would take her to hell on earth. But she looked at him one last time as they loaded her up, and in that look was an accusation that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "You could have saved me. You chose not to." The wagon disappeared into the storm, taking with it the last piece of his daughter's legacy. Silas stood in the mud and rain, feeling older than his 63 years, wondering how a man could fail the same way twice and still call himself human. Thunder crashed overhead, and for a moment it sounded almost like laughter, cruel, mocking laughter from a god who'd finally run out of patience with Silas Rowe's cowardice. The Rowe Ranch had once been the pride of the territory, its sprawling acres supporting the finest cattle and horses west of the Mississippi. Now it squatted in the morning light, like a monument to failure, its buildings weathered gray, and its fields choked with weeds. Silas had built it with his own hands when he'd married Emma, believing the future stretched before them, bright as summer wheat. But that future had died, with his wife poisoned by the same pride that had just cost him his granddaughter. He sat at his kitchen table as dawn broke gray in cold nursing coffee that had gone bitter hours ago. The newspaper lay folded beside him, its headlines trumpeting the territorial governor's latest economic initiatives. But the words might as well have been hieroglyphics for all the attention he paid them. His mind was trapped in an endless loop, replaying the auction, the child's face, the moment he'd chosen silence over courage. The knock at his door came just after sunrise. Silas opened it to find Doc Hartwell standing on his porch, the old physician's face grave with exhaustion. He held a yellowed envelope in his weathered hands, and his eyes held a weight that spoke of secrets carried too long. "I'm mourning, Silas," Doc said quietly. "Mind if I come in? We need to talk." "About what?" "About the letter I should have given you 7 years ago. About the promise I made to a dying woman. About the child who just got sold to the devil himself while her grandfather stood by and watched." The words hit Silas like physical blows. He stepped aside, letting the doctor enter, and closed the door against the morning chill. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Doc settled into a chair without invitation, his old bones creaking in protest. "That girl at the auction last night, Josephine. You saw her face, Silas. You saw who she looks like. I saw a child in need of help, nothing more. Lucille's child, your granddaughter." Doc's voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he held out the envelope. "This is from her, from Lucille. Written the night she died, after you'd already made it clear you wanted nothing to do with her or her baby." Silas stared at the letter as if it were a viper. His name was written on the front in Lucille's familiar script, the ink faded, but still legible. For 7 years this letter had existed, carrying his daughter's final words, and he'd never known. "Why now?" he asked. "Why didn't you give this to me when she died?" "Because you made your feelings clear that night. You said she was no daughter of yours, that her bastard child would never bear the Rowe name. I figured you'd just burn it without reading it." Doc's eyes hardened. "But that was before I watched a 7-year-old girl get sold to human traffickers while her blood family stood in the crowd doing nothing. You don't understand. I understand plenty. I understand that pride is a poison that kills everything it touches. I understand that your daughter loved you right up until her last breath, despite everything you'd done to her. And I understand that child is the last piece of her left in this world." Silas took the letter with shaking hands. The paper felt fragile, as if it might crumble at his touch. For a moment, he could almost smell Lucille's perfume, hear her laughter echoing through the empty rooms of his house. "Read it," Doc urged. "Read what she wanted to tell you." With trembling fingers, Silas broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet. Lucille's words swam before his eyes, blurred by tears he refused to acknowledge. "Dearest Father, I know you'll never forgive me for the shame I've brought to our family, and I don't expect you to. I know I've failed you in every way that matters, disappointed every hope you ever had for me. But I need you to know that I've never stopped loving you, even when you called me dead to you. You raised me to be strong, to stand up for what I believe in. Maybe that's why I couldn't give up Thomas, even when I knew it would cost me everything. He's dead now, Father. Thomas died in my arms 3 days ago, coughing up blood and calling for his mother. The consumption took him fast, but not fast enough to spare us both the dying. I feel it in my lungs now, the same sickness that killed him. Doc says I might have weeks, maybe days. The baby's due any time, and I'm scared not of dying, but of leaving her alone in this world with no one to love her. She moves so much inside me, Father. She's got your stubbornness already, I can tell. When she kicks it, feels like she's fighting to get out and take on the world. I've been calling her Josephine after grandmother. I want her to have something of our family, even if she never knows where it came from. I know what you'll say, that she's a half-breed bastard, that she'll never be worthy of the Rowe name. But she's innocent in all this. Whatever sins I've committed, whatever shame I've brought down on us, don't let them fall on her head. She has your eyes, Father. Your chin. She's a Rowe through and through, no matter what name she carries. Maeve says she'll take her if the worst happens. She's a good woman, kinder than I deserve. But she's not family. She's not blood. And this baby? She deserves to know where she comes from. She deserves to know that she had a mother who loved her enough to die for her, and a grandfather who might find it in his heart to forgive them both. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you finally found the courage to face the truth. I hope it's not too late, Father. I hope there's still time to save her from the mistakes that killed me. I love you. I've always loved you. Please don't let that love die with me. Your daughter, Lucille. P.S. I named her Josephine Lucille, but I wrote just Josephine on the church records. I thought maybe someday you'd want to give her the rest of her name yourself. The letter fell from Silas's nerveless fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. He sat there, paralyzed by the weight of 7 years' worth of mistakes, feeling as if the ground had opened beneath his feet. She knew, he whispered. She knew she was dying, and she still wanted me to take the child. She wanted you to love that child the way you couldn't love her, Doc said gently. She wanted to give you a second chance to do right by your family. And I threw it away. I stood there last night and watched my own granddaughter get sold to those animals, and I didn't lift a finger to stop it. It's not too late, Silas. They haven't left town yet. The Gaskills always spend the night at Murphy's boarding house after an auction. They'll head out at first light tomorrow. Silas looked up sharply. What are you saying? I'm saying you've got maybe 18 hours to decide what kind of man you really are. Are you the coward who let pride destroy his family? Or are you the grandfather who'll move heaven and earth to save his granddaughter? Before Silas could answer, another knock echoed through the house. This time, it was Maeve McCarthy, her face streaked with tears and her hands wringing her apron. Behind her stood Tom Brennan, the town sheriff, his badge gleaming dully in the morning light. Silas. Maeve gasped, pushing past Doc Hartwell. They've got her locked up in the boarding house. I tried to see her, but that monster Jacob Gaskell threatened to set his dogs on me if I came back. Easy, Maeve, Sheriff Brennan said, stepping into the kitchen. His face was grim, older than his 40 years. We've got a problem, Silas. A big one. What kind of problem? The kind that involves federal marshals and territorial politics. Brennan removed his hat, running his fingers through thinning hair. Word came down from the Capitol this morning. There's been complaints about the auction process, questions about where some of these adopted children end up. Washington sending investigators. Silas felt a flicker of hope. Then they'll stop this. They'll save Josie. Maybe. Or maybe they'll just make Claiborne more careful about covering his tracks. Either way, the Gaskills are spooked. Word is they're planning to leave tonight instead of tomorrow morning. Take the girls south to the mining camps where nobody asks questions about missing children. The hope died as quickly as it had been born. How long do we have? They'll move after dark. Figure to be gone before anyone notices. Brennan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Silas, I've got kids of my own. If that was my daughter's child sitting in that boarding house, I'd do whatever it took to get her back. But I've also got a badge and responsibilities to the whole town. I can't officially sanction what you might be thinking, but unofficially, I might be out of town on business tonight. Might not get back until tomorrow afternoon. Funny how these things work out sometimes. Maeve grabbed Silas's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. Please, she begged. I can't lose her too. She's all I've got left of Lucille, all that's left of the good I tried to do in this world. Silas looked at the three faces surrounding him, and the doctor who delivered his granddaughter, the sheriff who was willing to look the other way, and the woman who'd raised Lucille's child with more love than he'd ever shown his own daughter. They were offering him redemption, a chance to finally do the right thing. But redemption came with a price. If he acted, if he took Josie from the Gaskills, he'd be confessing to the whole world that she was his blood. The whispers would start the questions about why he'd abandoned her for 7 years. His reputation, carefully rebuilt after Lucille's disgrace, would crumble overnight. I need time to think, he said finally. Time's the one thing we don't have, Doc Hartwell replied. Those men will disappear with that child, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what happened to her. Just like you've spent the last 7 years wondering what might have been if you'd shown Lucille mercy instead of judgment. After they left, Silas sat alone in his kitchen, staring at Lucille's letter. Outside, the day wore on, bringing him closer to the moment when he'd have to choose between his pride and his granddaughter's life. The same choice he'd faced 20 years ago when Lucille had stood on his porch begging for forgiveness. He'd chosen pride then, and it had killed his daughter as surely as if he'd put a gun to her head. Now history was repeating itself, offering him a chance to save the last piece of her left in this world. The question was whether he'd learned anything from 20 years of regret, or if he was doomed to make the same mistake twice. As darkness fell over Coyote Fork, Silas found himself standing in the shadows across from Murphy's boarding house, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The 2-story building squatted on the edge of town like a carbuncle, its windows glowing yellow in the night. From where he stood, he could see figures moving behind the curtains on the 2nd floor, the Gaskill brothers preparing for their journey south. He'd spent the day in agonizing indecision, pacing his empty house like a caged animal. Every rational thought told him to walk away, to let the federal investigators handle the situation through proper channels. But rationality was a luxury he couldn't afford when his granddaughter's life hung in the balance. The decision had finally crystallized when he'd found himself standing in Lucille's old room, surrounded by her belongings that he'd preserved like religious relics. Her books still lined the shelves, her dresses still hung in the wardrobe, her perfume still lingered faintly in the air. But for all his careful preservation, she was gone as dead as if he'd buried every trace of her existence. Josie was different. Josie was alive, breathing real. She was his last chance to honor his daughter's memory, to prove that love could triumph over pride. A figure emerged from the boarding house's side entrance, moving carefully through the shadows. Silas tensed his hand, moving to the Colt at his hip, but relaxed when he recognized Maeve's familiar silhouette. She crossed the street quickly, keeping to the darkness. They've got her in the back room upstairs. She whispered, her Irish accent thick with tension. Window faces the alley bars on the outside. But I brought these. She pressed a small bundle into his hands, a rope, a crowbar, and a bottle of lamp oil. What's the oil for? Distraction. If things go wrong, you might need to create some confusion. Her green eyes glittered in the starlight. Silas, are you sure about this? Once you take her, there's no going back. The whole territory will know what you've done. I should have done it 20 years ago, he replied. Should have stood up for Lucille when she needed me most. I won't make the same mistake twice. They separated, Maeve heading back to her own place, while Silas made his way around to the alley behind the boarding house. The building's rear wall was scarred and weathered with a fire escape leading to the second floor. He could see the barred window. Maeve had described a faint light glowing behind the curtains. Climbing the fire escape felt like ascending to his own execution. Each step brought him closer to the point of no return and the moment when he'd have to choose between safety and salvation. At the top, he pressed his ear to the wall, listening for sounds from within. Voices drifted through the thin walls, Jacob Gaskell's harsh growl, his brother's higher-pitched whine, and occasionally, heartbreakingly, a child's frightened whimper. They were discussing their route south, debating which mining camps offered the best prices for merchandise. "She's a pretty one," Ezra was saying. "Could probably get 300 for her once she's properly broken in." "Don't damage the goods," Jacob replied. "Buyer likes them fresh. Besides, she's young enough to train proper. Give us a year or two, she'll fetch twice that much." Silas felt bile rise in his throat. These weren't men, they were monsters discussing his granddaughter like she was livestock. He gripped the crowbar tighter, fighting the urge to smash through the window and strangle them both with his bare hands. But that would only get them all killed. He needed to be smart, careful, patient. Wait for the right moment. That moment came, an hour later, when he heard the brothers discussing supper. One of them, Jacob, by the sound of it, was going downstairs to fetch food from the tavern. That would leave Ezra alone with Josie, evening the odds considerably. Silas waited until he heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, then began working the crowbar between the window bars. The old iron was corroded and brittle, and after several tense minutes, he managed to pry one loose. It was just enough space for a child to squeeze through. He tapped gently on the glass, hoping to attract Josie's attention without alerting Ezra. A small face appeared at the window, eyes wide with confusion and hope. It was the first time Silas had seen his granddaughter up close, and the resemblance to Lucille nearly stopped his heart. She had the same delicate features, the same intelligent brown eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw that had driven him to distraction 20 years ago. "Don't be afraid," he whispered through the glass. "I'm here to help you." "Who are you?" Her voice was barely audible, but he could hear the desperate hope in it. He paused, the words catching in his throat. "I'm your grandfather. Your mother was my daughter." Her eyes widened even further. "Mama had a father." "She did. And she loved you very much. I'm going to get you out of here, but you have to be very quiet." "Can you do that?" She nodded quickly, then glanced toward the door. "The mean man is still here. He has a big knife. I know. But he's going to be distracted in a moment. When I give you the signal, you climb through this window as fast as you can. Don't look back, don't hesitate. Just climb." Silas moved carefully along the fire escape until he could see into the front room where Ezra Gaskell sat cleaning his weapons. The man was focused on his task, humming tunelessly to himself as he ran an oiled cloth along the blade of a wicked-looking Bowie knife. The bottle of lamp oil felt heavy in Silas's pocket. He'd never considered himself an arsonist, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He unscrewed the cap and began pouring the oil along the wooden siding below the front windows, the sharp smell mixing with the night air. When he struck the match, the flames caught with a whoosh that lit up the alley like daylight. Within seconds, the fire was climbing the building's weathered walls, and shouts of alarm echoed from within. "Fire, fire!" Someone screamed from downstairs. Boots pounded on the floorboards as the boarding house's residents scrambled for safety. Through the window, Silas could see Ezra Gaskell jump to his feet, knife in hand, torn between guarding his prisoner and investigating the commotion. The choice was made for him when smoke began seeping under the door. "Shit," Ezra snarled, rushing toward the window to assess the fire's spread. "Jacob's gonna kill me if we lose our payday to some damn..." That's when Silas struck. He'd circled back to Josie's window while Ezra was distracted, and now he smashed the glass with his crowbar. The sound was lost in the chaos of shouts and running feet as half the town responded to the fire alarm. "And now," he hissed, reaching through the broken window. "Come on, sweetheart." Josie didn't hesitate. She squeezed through the gap between the bars, ignoring the broken glass that scraped her arms, and fell into his waiting embrace. She was lighter than he'd expected, all bones and fear trembling like a wounded bird. "Grandfather," she whispered against his neck. "Is it really you?" "It's me," he replied, holding her close as he started down the fire escape. "You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you." They'd almost reached the ground when Ezra Gaskell appeared at the broken window, his face twisted with fury and smoke. "Hey, stop, thief." But his shouts were drowned out by the clamor of the fire brigade and the general chaos as people rushed to form bucket chains. In the confusion, nobody paid attention to one old man carrying a child away from the burning building. Silas reached his horse and lifted Josie into the saddle, then swung up behind her. As they rode away from the flames and shouting, she leaned back against his chest. And he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, the weight of family, the responsibility and joy of having someone depend on him completely. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Home," he replied, surprised by how right the word sounded. "We're going home." Behind them, Murphy's boarding house burned against the night sky, the flames visible for miles across the prairie. But Silas didn't look back. For the first time in decades, his eyes were fixed firmly on the future, on the road that led back to the ranch where his granddaughter belonged. The real battle was just beginning. Jacob Gaskell would come looking for his lost property. Claiborne would demand answers, and the whole town would want to know why Silas Rowe had suddenly claimed a child he'd ignored for 7 years. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, he had his granddaughter back, and he'd be damned if he'd let anyone take her away again. The Rowe Ranch had never looked more welcoming than it did in the pre-dawn darkness, its familiar silhouette rising against the star-studded sky like a promise of sanctuary. Silas helped Josie down from the horse, noting how she favored her left arm where the broken glass had scraped her during their escape. "Is this where Mama lived?" she asked, staring up at the 2-story house with wonder. "It is. This was her home until—" He stopped, not sure how to explain 20 years of mistakes to a 7-year-old. "Until she had to leave." "Why did she have to leave?" "Because I was a fool," he said simply. "Because I let pride matter more than love." Inside the house, he lit the oil lamps and built up the fire, filling the empty rooms with warmth and light for the first time in years. Josie stood in the doorway, taking in everything with wide, curious eyes. The family portraits on the walls, the furniture covered in dust, sheets the sense of abandonment that permeated every corner. "It's so big," she whispered, "and so quiet." "It hasn't had children in it for a long time," Silas admitted. "But maybe that's about to change." He led her upstairs to Lucille's old room, pulling the dust cover off the furniture to reveal a space frozen in time. The bed was still made with her favorite quilt, her books still stacked on the nightstand, her childhood dolls still arranged on the window seat. It was a shrine to memory, carefully preserved but never lived in. "This was Mama's room," he said, his voice catching slightly. "She would have wanted you to have it." Josie approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. She picked up one of the dolls, a rag creation with yellow yarn hair and button eyes, and held it close. "Tell me about her," she said. "Tell me about my mama." So he did, as he cleaned and bandaged her cuts, as he helped her into one of Lucille's old nightgowns, altered hastily with pins to fit her small frame. As he tucked her into bed beneath her mother's quilt, he told her stories. About Lucille's laughter that could charm birds from the trees. About her stubborn streak that got her into trouble. About her kindness to every stray animal that wandered onto the ranch. "She sounds wonderful," Josie murmured sleepily. "I wish I could have known her." "You would have loved her," Silas replied. and she would have loved you more than life itself. Do you think she can see us now from heaven? The question caught him off guard. He'd spent so many years angry at God, at fate, at the cruel circumstances that had torn his family apart, that he'd never considered the possibility of divine oversight. But looking at his granddaughter's hopeful face, he found himself wanting to believe. "I think she can," he said finally. "I think she's smiling right now, seeing you safe in her old bed." Josie's eyes drifted closed, exhaustion finally claiming her. But just before she fell asleep, she whispered, "I'm glad you found me, grandfather. I was so scared." "I'm sorry it took so long," he replied, brushing a strand of dark hair from her forehead. "I'll never let anyone hurt you again. That's a promise." He sat beside her bed for a long time, watching her sleep, marveling at the miracle of her existence. This was Lucille's daughter, his blood, his legacy. The last chance to make amends for 20 years of failure. A sound from downstairs interrupted his vigil. The creak of floorboards, the whisper of boot leather on wood. Someone was in his house, moving carefully through the darkened rooms below. Silas drew his gun and moved toward the stairs, every sense alert. A voice called from the kitchen. "I know you're here, saw your horse outside, still warm from riding." Jacob Gaskell. He'd tracked them here faster than expected, probably following their trail from the boarding house fire. Silas cursed under his breath. He'd been hoping for more time, a chance to prepare for the confrontation he knew was coming. "Come down here, old man, we need to talk." Silas glanced back at Josie's room, making sure she was still sleeping, then descended the stairs with his Colt drawn. He found Gaskell standing in his kitchen, the outlaw's scarred face twisted with fury. The man's clothes were singed from the fire, and his eyes held the dangerous light of someone who'd been pushed too far. "You got some nerve, Rowe," Gaskell snarled. "Burning down half the town to steal my property." "She's not property," Silas replied evenly. "She's my granddaughter." "Your what?" Gaskell laughed harshly. "That's rich. 7 years that brat's been living in poverty, and now you decide your family convenient timing, ain't it?" "I made mistakes. I'm trying to correct them. By arson and theft, by stealing a child that was legally purchased through proper channels." Gaskell's hand moved to the gun at his hip. "I paid good money for that girl. She's worth a fortune to the right buyer." "She's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, old man. Question is, what's your price? I'm a reasonable businessman. I'll give you a cut of the profits if you hand her over nice and quiet." Silas felt disgust rise in his throat. "Get out of my house." "Can't do that. See, I got a reputation to maintain. Word gets out that some broken-down rancher can steal my merchandise without consequences, I'll be out of business inside a month." Gaskell's smile was cold as winter. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to bring that girl down here, and I'm going to take her where she belongs. You can walk away from this row, live to see another sunrise. Or you can die defending a bastard child who ain't even really your blood." "She is my blood. She's Lucille's daughter." "Lucille." Gaskell's expression shifted, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. "Wait a minute. You talking about that half-breed whore who died in birthing, the one who—" He never finished the sentence. Silas's fist caught him in the mouth, splitting his lip and sending him staggering backward. The insult to Lucille's memory had triggered something primal in the old rancher, a fury that burned hotter than the fire he'd set at the boarding house. "Don't you ever speak her name?" Silas growled, advancing on the larger man. "Don't you even think it?" Gaskell spat blood and drew his gun, but Silas was already moving. Years of ranch work had kept his reflexes sharp, and he managed to grab the outlaw's wrist before the weapon could clear leather. They struggled in the narrow kitchen, crashing into furniture, grunting with effort as each man tried to gain control of the pistol. The gun went off the bullet, shattering a window and sending glass cascading to the floor. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and both men froze for a moment, ears ringing. That's when Josie appeared at the top of the stairs, her small face pale with terror. "My grandfather!" she screamed. "Help!" Her cry broke Gaskell's concentration for just an instant, but it was enough. Silas drove his elbow into the man's solar plexus, doubling him over, then brought his knee up to connect with Gaskell's jaw. The outlaw went down hard, his gun skittering across the kitchen floor. But Jacob Gaskell hadn't survived 20 years on the frontier by giving up easily. As Silas reached for the fallen weapon, Gaskell pulled a knife from his boot and lunged upward, the blade aimed at the rancher's heart. Time seemed to slow. Silas saw the knife coming, felt his own mortality hanging by a thread, and knew with crystal clarity that he was about to die. After everything, finding Josie, bringing her home, promising to protect her, he was going to fail her just as he'd failed her mother. The shot came from the doorway, loud as thunder in the confined space. Gaskell jerked sideways, the knife spinning from his nerveless fingers as Sheriff Brennan's bullet took him in the shoulder. "Drop it, Jacob." Brennan commanded, stepping into the kitchen with his smoking revolver trained on the wounded outlaw. "It's over." Gaskell clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face twisted with pain and rage. "This ain't none of your business, Tom. Child trafficking became my business the moment it started happening in my territory." The sheriff replied, "Doc Hartwell's been keeping records, Jacob. Names, dates, payments. We know about the whole operation. You can't prove nothing. Ken, I got your brother Ezra singing like a canary back in town. Seems he don't much like the idea of hanging for murder, so he's telling us everything, every child you've trafficked, every payment you've made, every contact in your network." Brennan's voice was cold as winter steel. "You're done, Jacob. Question is whether you come in alive or get carried out in a pine box." Gaskell's eyes darted between the sheriff and Silas, calculating his odds. Blood seeped through his fingers from the shoulder wound, and his face was pale with shock and pain. But there was still fight in him, still the desperate cunning of a cornered predator. "The girl's still legally mine," he said through gritted teeth. "Sale was witness documented. That old bastard committed arson and kidnapping when he took her. That old bastard just saved his granddaughter from a fate worse than death." Brennan replied. "And as for legal ownership," he smiled grimly. "Funny thing about that. Turns out Reverend Claiborne never had the authority to conduct those auctions in the first place. Territorial government's been investigating his operation for months. Every sale he made in the last 5 years is null and void." Silas felt a surge of hope mixed with disbelief. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your granddaughter was never legally sold to anyone. The whole auction was a sham designed to give a veneer of respectability to human trafficking." Brennan kept his gun trained on Gaskell as he spoke. "Federal marshals are already on their way to arrest Claiborne. Should be here by morning." Gaskell snarled in frustration and pain. "This ain't over, Rowe. You think you've won, but you got no idea what kind of forces you're up against. The network's bigger than you imagine: politicians, businessmen, law enforcement. They'll come for the girl, and when they do, they'll have to go through me," Silas said quietly. "And every other decent person in this territory who's finally had enough of your kind of evil." The sheriff moved closer, never taking his eyes off the wounded outlaw. "Jacob Gaskell, you're under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy, attempted murder, and a whole host of other charges. You have the right to." A crash from upstairs interrupted him. All 3 men looked up at the ceiling as heavy footsteps pounded across the floorboards above. "Ezra," Gaskell breathed hope, flickering in his eyes. "Told you he was singing like a canary, Tom. But which song is he singing?" Brennan's face went pale as he realized the implications. If Ezra Gaskell had escaped custody, if he'd come here seeking revenge or to claim Josie himself. A child's scream pierced the night, Josie's voice high and terrified, calling for her grandfather. Silas didn't think. He lunged for the fallen gun, scooped it up, and raced for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. Behind him, he could hear Brennan shouting orders, the sound of handcuffs clicking, as the sheriff secured Jacob Gaskell. The upstairs hallway was dark lit only by the faint glow from Josie's room. As Silas approached, he could hear voices, his granddaughter's frightened whimpers, and a man's harsh whispers. "Shut up, you little brat. Stop squirming or I'll cut your throat right here." Ezra Gaskell stood beside Lucille's old bed, holding Josie against his chest with one arm while pressing a knife to her throat with the other. His clothes were torn and bloody. Evidently his escape from custody hadn't been easy, and his eyes held the wild desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. "Let her go, Ezra," Silas said, raising his gun. "This is between you and me." "Is it?" Ezra's voice cracked with hysteria. "You cost me everything, old man. Burned down my base of operations, got my brother shot, destroyed 20 years of careful planning. You think I'm just gonna walk away from that? The girl's innocent. She never did anything to you. She's leverage." Ezra pressed the knife closer to Josie's throat, and a thin line of blood appeared on her pale skin. "She's my ticket out of this mess. You're gonna get me a horse, food, and money, or I'm gonna paint these walls with her blood." Silas felt his world tilting on its axis. 20 years ago, he'd failed to protect Lucille from the consequences of her choices. Now history was repeating itself, but this time the stakes were even higher. This time he had a chance to save his granddaughter if he could find the courage to act. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I want you to suffer like I'm suffering," Ezra snarled. "I want you to know what it feels like to lose everything that matters. This little bastard is all you got left of your precious daughter, ain't she? What's it gonna be like watching her die, knowing it's all your fault?" "Please," Josie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Grandfather, help me." The plea broke something inside Silas, not his spirit, but the last barrier holding back 20 years of accumulated rage and guilt and desperate love. This was his moment of truth, his chance to finally be the man his daughter had needed, the grandfather his blood deserved. "You want to know what it's like to lose everything?" he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I already know. I lost my wife to a broken heart. I lost my daughter to my own pride. I've been living with that pain every day for 20 years. Then you know how I feel." "No, I don't." Silas took a step closer, ignoring the gun Ezra was trying to draw with his free hand. "Because you chose this life. You chose to prey on children, to destroy families, to profit from misery. I made mistakes, but I never sold my soul to the devil." "Stop right there or she dies." "She dies anyway if I let you take her," Silas replied, still advancing. "At least this way she dies knowing someone fought for her. Someone loved her enough to try. You're crazy, maybe, but I'm done running from my failures." Silas was close enough now to see the sweat beading on Ezra's forehead, to smell the fear and desperation radiating from the man. "I'm done letting innocent people pay for my cowardice." That's when Sheriff Brennan appeared in the doorway, his own gun drawn. "Let the child go, Ezra. You're surrounded." The distraction lasted only a second, but it was enough. Ezra's eyes flicked toward the sheriff, and in that instant, Silas lunged forward. His left hand grabbed Ezra's wrist, forcing the knife away from Josie's throat, while his right brought the gun up between them. They struggled briefly, Ezra's desperation giving him strength. But 20 years of ranch work had kept Silas hard and lean. He twisted Ezra's wrist until the man cried out and dropped the knife, then shoved his granddaughter away from danger. "Get back," he shouted to Josie, who scrambled toward the corner of the room. Ezra made one last desperate play, clawing for the gun in Silas's hand. They wrestled for control, the weapon wavering between them, neither man able to gain a decisive advantage. The gun fired. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Ezra Gaskell staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, a spreading stain of red across his chest. He looked down at the wound, then back at Silas, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally resignation. "Should have minded your own business, old man," he whispered, then collapsed to the floor. Silas stood over the body, the smoking gun trembling in his hands. He'd taken a life not in war, not in self-defense, but to protect his family. The weight of that act would stay with him forever, but he found he could live with it. Some things were worth killing for. Grandfather. Josie ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. You saved me. You really saved me. He dropped the gun and held her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, breathing in the scent of her hair. She was alive, safe home where she belonged. Nothing else mattered. Are you hurt? He asked, checking the thin cut on her throat. It was superficial, more frightening than dangerous, but it would leave a scar, a permanent reminder of this night. I'm okay, she whispered. I knew you'd come for me. I knew you wouldn't let them take me away. Sheriff Brennan holstered his weapon and knelt beside Ezra's body, checking for a pulse. He's dead, he announced. Clear case of self-defense. I'll testify to that in court. Will there be a court? Silas asked, suddenly aware of how much his life had changed in the space of a few hours. Will they try to take her away again? Not if I have anything to say about it. Brennan stood, his face grim but determined. Like I said, the federal government's been building a case against this trafficking network for months. You didn't commit a crime tonight, Silas. You exposed one. Probably saved dozens of other children in the process. Dawn was breaking over the prairie by the time the last of the officials left the ranch. Federal marshals had taken Jacob Gaskell into custody. Coroners had removed his brother's body, and investigators had begun the process of unraveling the network that had terrorized families across the territory. Silas sat on his front porch with Josie curled up in his lap, both of them exhausted, but finally at peace. The nightmare was over, the immediate danger past. They had survived together. What happens now? Josie asked sleepily. Now we live. Silas replied, stroking her hair. We learn to be a family. We honor your mother's memory by building something good together. Will people say bad things about me, about being a bastard? The word stung, but Silas faced it head on. Some will. But their words can't change who you are. Josephine Lucille Rowe, my granddaughter, your mother's legacy. Let them talk. We know the truth. She was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then, I want to visit Mama's grave. Will you take me? Of course. We'll go today if you want. We'll tell her you're home. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope. Not just for himself, but for the future. He'd been given a second chance to be the man his family deserved, and this time he wouldn't waste it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be legal challenges, social prejudice, and the ongoing struggle to build a relationship with a child who barely knew him. But they would face it together, as family. I love you, grandfather. Josie murmured against his chest. I love you too, sweetheart. He replied, his voice thick with emotion. More than you'll ever know. The ghosts of his past still haunted the empty rooms of the ranch house, but they no longer seemed malevolent. Emma's gentle spirit whispered approval, proud of the man he was becoming. Lucille's restless soul finally found peace, knowing her daughter was safe and loved. As they sat together in the morning light, grandfather and granddaughter began the long journey toward healing, toward family, toward the redemption that had eluded Silas for so many years. The cruel man who had once kicked his pregnant daughter out of the house was gone, replaced by someone willing to fight for love, to sacrifice pride for family, to kill for the innocent. It was a start. 6 months later, the courtroom in Silver Creek was packed beyond capacity, with spectators spilling out into the corridors and onto the courthouse steps. The trial of the decade was reaching its climax, and everyone wanted to witness history in the making. Silas sat at the prosecutor's table, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap, as he listened to the closing arguments. Beside him, Josie fidgeted in her best dress, the blue one with white lace that he'd bought her for her 8th birthday. Her dark eyes taking in everything with the intense curiosity that reminded him so much of her mother. The past 6 months had transformed both their lives beyond recognition. The immediate aftermath of that terrible night had brought federal investigators, newspaper reporters, and politicians from across the territory, all drawn by the scandal of the trafficking network that had operated under everyone's noses for years. But more importantly, it had brought them together as a family. The adjustment hadn't been easy. Josie had nightmares about men with knives startling awake screaming for her grandfather. Silas struggled with his own demons, the guilt over Lucille, the weight of having killed a man, the fear that he was too old and set in his ways to raise a child properly. But they'd worked through it together with help from Doc Hartwell, Maeve McCarthy, and the surprising support of most of the town. The revelation of Claiborne's crimes had shifted public opinion dramatically. Where once there had been whispers and judgment about Silas harboring a bastard child, now there was admiration for the grandfather who'd risked everything to save his granddaughter. The ladies and gentlemen of the jury. The federal prosecutor was saying, his voice ringing through the packed courtroom. The evidence against Reverend Claiborne is overwhelming. For 15 years, this man used his position of trust to sell children into slavery, to profit from human misery, to destroy families across this territory. At the defendant's table, Claiborne sat hunched and broken, his pale face gaunt with the weight of his crimes. Gone was the confident manipulator who'd once controlled Coyote Fork through fear and corruption. In his place sat a hollow shell of a man facing the gallows for his crimes. The trial had revealed the full scope of the trafficking network, dozens of children sold to mining camps, railroad construction crews, and worse. Many had been recovered, reunited with their families, or placed in legitimate homes. Others remained missing, their fates unknown. But this case is about more than one man's crimes. The prosecutor continued. It's about the courage of ordinary people who refused to stand by while evil flourished in their midst. People like Silas Rowe, who risked his life to save his granddaughter. People like Dr. Hartwell, who kept careful records despite the danger. People like Sheriff Brennan, who chose justice over politics. Silas glanced at the jury box, trying to read their faces. 12 men, mostly ranchers and townspeople from across the territory, their expressions grave as they absorbed the weight of their responsibility. The defense has argued that Reverend Claiborne believed he was helping these children, providing them with homes and opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. The prosecutor said, his voice dripping with scorn. But I ask you, what kind of help is it to sell a 7-year-old girl to men who openly discussed using her as a prostitute? What kind of Christian charity profits from the suffering of innocents? He paused, letting the words sink in, then turned to face the jury directly. Josephine Rowe sits in this courtroom today because her grandfather found the courage to act when the legal system failed her. She's alive, she's safe, she's loved. But only because one man decided that some things are worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. The prosecutor walked over to where Silas and Josie sat, placing his hand gently on the child's shoulder. How many other children weren't so lucky? How many disappeared into that network of evil because good people chose to look the other way? That's the real tragedy here, not just the crimes that were committed, but the ones that could have been prevented if someone had spoken up sooner. He returned to his place before the jury box, his voice rising with passion. You have a chance today to send a message that will echo across this territory and beyond. A message that children are not commodities to be bought and sold. That those who prey on the innocent will face justice no matter how high their positions or how deep their connections. That ordinary people working together can defeat even the most entrenched evil. He pointed at Claiborne, his finger trembling with righteous anger. Find this man guilty on all charges. Give him the punishment his crimes deserve. And give hope to every parent, every grandparent, every person who's ever loved a child, that justice still exists in this world. The defense attorney's closing argument was perfunctory, hampered by the overwhelming evidence and his client's partial confession during testimony. Claiborne had tried to portray himself as a misguided but well-intentioned man, but the jury's faces suggested they weren't buying it. After 3 hours of deliberation, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Josie grabbed Silas's hand, squeezing tight as they watched Claiborne slump in his chair, finally broken by the weight of justice. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over," Silas replied, pulling her close. "You're safe now. We both are." The sentencing came a week later. Death by hanging for the murder charges, life in prison for the trafficking. Claiborne would spend his remaining days in the territorial penitentiary, assuming he lived long enough to serve the sentence. But the real victory wasn't in the courthouse. It was in the weeks and months that followed as Silas and Josie built the life that Lucille had dreamed of for her daughter. They visited her grave, regularly bringing flowers and stories about Josie's progress in school, her new friends, her growing confidence. The headstone now bore a new inscription, added by popular subscription from the people of Coyote Fork. Lucille Rowe, beloved daughter and mother, 1855–1878. Her love lives on. Josie was thriving in ways that amazed everyone who knew her. The frightened, traumatized child who'd been sold at auction had blossomed into a bright, confident girl who excelled in her studies and had a gift for making friends. The nightmares had faded, replaced by dreams of the future. "I want to be a lawyer when I grow up," she announced one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "A lawyer?" Silas raised an eyebrow. "That's a hard profession for anyone, especially a woman." "Then I'll be the first woman lawyer in the territory," she replied with typical Rowe stubbornness. "I want to help other children like me. Make sure the bad men can't hurt them." Looking at her determined face, Silas had no doubt she'd succeed. She had her mother's intelligence, her grandmother's compassion, and something new, a strength forged in adversity that would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The ranch was thriving again, too. Word of Silas's heroism had brought new respect and business opportunities. Neighbors who'd once shunned him now sought his counsel. Former skeptics had become friends and allies. But perhaps the most important change was in Silas himself. The bitter, isolated man who'd let pride destroy his family was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love required vulnerability, that redemption was possible, and that family wasn't just about blood, it was about choice, commitment, and the courage to do what was right. "Tell me again about the night you saved me," Josie said, curling up beside him on the porch swing. It was a frequent request, one that had become almost ritual between them. She needed to hear it to understand that she was worth fighting for, that someone had chosen her over safety and reputation and the easy path. "Well," Silas began, his arm tightening around her small frame. "It was the darkest night I'd ever seen, with rain coming down like the end of the world." As he told the story, their story, Silas marveled at how much his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been a lonely, bitter old man, haunted by his failures. Tonight, he was a grandfather, with a purpose, a future, and a love that made all the pain and struggle worthwhile. The cruel man who'd kicked his pregnant daughter out of the house was truly dead, now buried beneath the weight of redemption and the transformative power of a child's love. In his place sat someone new, someone worthy of the name grandfather, someone Lucille would have been proud to call father. "And then what happened?" Josie prompted, even though she knew the story by heart. "Then we came home," Silas said softly, "and we lived happily ever after." It was a fairy tale ending, perhaps, but it was their fairy tale. Earned through courage, sacrifice, and the belief that love could triumph over even the darkest evil. As the stars came out over the prairie, grandfather and granddaughter sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the ghosts of their past and the promise of their future. They had found each other, saved each other, and built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The story that had begun with failure and regret had ended with love and hope. Sometimes Silas reflected that was the best any human being could ask for, a second chance to get it right, and the wisdom to recognize it when it came. In the distance, coyotes howled at the rising moon, their voices carrying across the empty miles like a song of survival. Silas smiled and held his granddaughter closer, knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. The circle was complete. The debt was paid. The promise was kept. And in a small cemetery behind the ranch house, beneath a headstone covered with fresh flowers, the spirit of a young woman who died for love finally rested in peace, knowing her daughter was safe, loved, and home where she belonged.